Hello, friends. This is your host, Prashanth Daniel, and welcome to the Reasonable Truth Podcast, a program dedicated to helping Christians to understand, articulate, and defend their faith as winsome ambassadors of Christ. It is good to be back here again behind the microphone, and it's been kind of interesting with school starting up for the kids and everything. Life has gotten a lot more busier. But this is one of my favorite things to do, is to get together with some friends and talk about some very stimulating theological, philosophical, cultural issues and examine everything from a Christian worldview perspective. So this is my favorite part of my life, if I could put it that way. And I actually have some good friends on here today, and you guys are definitely going to enjoy today's episode. Let me introduce the great, my partner in crime, Carlos Pamplona, who is joining us today for this episode. Carlos, welcome, buddy.
Hey, Prashant, thanks for having us again, and I'm happy to be seeing you and Finney as well.
That's great. That's great. And I want to introduce our main guest for today. This is Finney Premkumar. Finney Premkumar is the founder and president of Truth Matters International, a ministry that is focused on confronting those in the academy with the truth of the gospel and in challenging those in the church to live out the content of the gospel in creative and concrete ways. Undergirded by a strong philosophical and theological approach, this ministry seeks to challenge the dominant ideological voices of our time by presenting the reality of God's eternal word. Finney is very passionate about evangelism and has spoken at numerous churches, organizations, conventions, youth conferences, and mission-related events. He also regularly addresses issues related to philosophy, science, technology, ethics, and related topics, and has presented academic lectures and papers at various universities, including Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Yale, and Notre Dame, amongst others. Finney, so wonderful to have you joining us today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day that when was the first time we actually got to talk? I believe it was on a radio show on apologetics.com.
Right.
I think
Right.
we were talking with Dr. John Marriott about deconversion and things like that. And I think you and I were
Yeah.
panelists.
Right. That's when I first heard about you, and that's when I first heard your voice. But that was, I think, in 2019,
That's
if
right.
I'm not mistaken,
That's right.
May or June of 2019. And then it was wonderful to see you in person at the conference in Biola that was organized by your ministry, and I was really blessed to be there. That was, I think, in March, was it, or April?
No, that was in June, just about 3 months ago.
June.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I remember the first time we talked, and Jacob had actually told me about you, and then the first thing I actually remember thinking as soon as I heard your voice was like, oh man, this guy must be like an opera singer or something. He has just a tremendous voice, and it just sounds wonderful. And then I think you and I kind of started texting and just kind of communicating, and
Right.
we would talk on the phone every
Right.
couple of months or something like that. And
Right.
yes, we
Right.
finally got to meet in June at the Reasonable Truths Conference. So yeah, wonderful
Yeah.
to be able to do that. And of course, Carlos. Yeah, Carlos, you also met Finney for the first time at the conference, I think.
That's right. Yeah, at the
Yes.
conference. Yeah, I heard a lot about Finney from you and from Jacob, and so it was good to meet you.
Yeah, it was great. It was good to finally everybody be there, and yeah, definitely, man. I mean, I'd love to have you on sometime. Maybe the Lord willing, at our next conference or some conference in the future. We should definitely have you on, and I think you have a breadth of experience and expertise that I think is such a blessing to the church and academia, and we could all benefit from that.
Praise God.
Anyways, yeah. So, Finney, let's start with this. Why don't you give us a little a little bit of your background and then a little bit about what is your primary doctoral work. And I'm especially interested, and I think our listeners will be interested to know as well, all the capacities in which you're working with Dr. Alistair McGrath and everything that is connected to that. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so I'm the son of a pastor, and my dad has been in pastoral ministry. He's been in ministry for about 50 years, and currently is teaching at a seminary. And so, I was really brought up in an environment where there was much talk about theology and philosophy and so on. And so my interest really grew as I got older and older. But when I made my recommitment to Christ and then made a commitment to the ministry, I really got into it in a technical way. And, it has been a journey. It's really been a journey. And much of the thinking that I've gone through in terms of my journey, just like everyone else, has been influenced by others. And so it really is a footnote to the people who have spoken into your life, who have influenced you, the books you've read, especially the philosophers or the professors that you have communicated with on a face-to-face basis. And so one of the people that has been really instrumental in my journey, I would say, is Alistair McGrath. I think it was 2015 when I first joined up, or when I first became part of these conferences at Oxford. And they had organized a joint conference with MIT, and the whole team from the Ian Ramsey Center came to MIT, and they hosted the conference there as a joint venture. And my paper was selected to be presented. And for the first time, I was opened up to this avenue of ideas, and the expressions of which really invoked in me a sense of excitement. And a lot of the professors who were there, Alistair McGrath and Andrew Pinsent, and a couple of people from MIT. And I was feeling very privileged to have been presenting my paper. And the feedback that I got really helped me in terms of my thinking. And then since then, till the current date, till 2022, I've been presenting papers at Oxford every single year. And so Alistair McGrath has been very gracious in terms of inviting me, and a host of other people over the years. And so a lot of my thinking have been shaped by my interaction with him and those who are working with him at the Institute, at the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion. And so in the conference that we had back in July, which is the latest one we had, it was really a conference geared towards really appreciating the work that Alistair McGrath has done. He just retired officially from Oxford from his academic duties. And so we focused on his work, and I focused mainly on his 3-volume Scientific Theology, and offered a constructive criticism of some of the ideas that he shared. And so it was a very productive time of thinking about faith and science and how these worlds interact, and what is the nature and the calling of the Christian apologist, and what are some of the built-in limitations of the apologetic task? Because sometimes we don't talk about the built-in limitations as much. And what are some things that we need to be wary of? What are some things that we need to watch out for in terms of our apologetic endeavor, so that we don't overlook some of the things that we need to be conscious of? So it was a very productive conference. Yeah.
No, that's very good. And, again, I've lost track of the number of people who have told me, or told us even in the last couple of years, that apologetics is so needed today in our time and age and in our culture. But apologetics itself is changing, and it's changing quite a bit because even our culture is changing quite a bit. And so I think, for whether we like it or not, if we're in the Christian field, and if we're writing, speaking, teaching on these issues, then it behooves us to understand what are the limitations of apologetics. So you mentioned limitations. So let's get into that. And Carlos, feel free to jump in as well and, ask a question or something like that. But what are some limitations of apologetics, and how do we remedy that?
Yeah, so apologetics as a discipline obviously seeks to defend the faith, seeks to clarify the faith. The defense of the faith can be seen as something external that we do in the context of those who are non-believers. And the clarification of the faith can be seen as something internal that which we do in the context of believers. So when we defend the faith, we might offer different arguments for God's existence, for instance, the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, the moral argument, and there are a slew of arguments that we offer. And there are many philosophers that have done tremendously marvelous job in terms of cumulative case arguments. And Richard Swinburne is one among them, who has probably put together a cumulative case argument in a better format than most of the other philosophers out there, both in a technical way and in a popular way. So that is the defense part of apologetics. And then apologetics as clarification. When we look at the church, when we look at the community of believers, there are certain concepts that need to be clarified. For instance, the concept of the Trinity, the concept of the hypostatic union, how God can be both divine and human in the person of Christ. And so there are a number of concepts, the concept of sin, the concept of the life to come, the concept of creation. What do we mean by creation? How did God bring things into being? So these are very, very important dimensions of apologetics, the defense, the clarification. But I think that apologetics needs to be thought about primarily in terms of being a witness, being a witness. Now that immediately brings in certain circumscribing boundaries for the discipline of apologetics. If apologetics is seen as witness primarily over and above other things, and everything else takes its place in the context of the apologist as a witness, then immediately apologetics as a venture becomes Christocentric. It becomes Christocentric. And so we usually look at 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within you and so on and so forth. But that verse is prefaced by these words, always revere Christ as Lord in your heart. And so the Christocentric nature of apologetics immediately takes what we do and puts a redemptive bent to it. So apologetics as witness is involved in the redemptive mission of God, in the redemptive mission of God. What does that mean? It means that we see the built-in limitations of purely rational arguments. It means that we see the built-in limitations of being purely philosophical or purely scientific. I think it was Martin Luther who once said, use reason not just in a magisterial sense, but in a ministerial sense. So now apologetics, being Christocentric, being circumscribed by Christ at the center, looks to reason and all of the other tools as things that are utilized, but utilized with a sense of being careful not to overdo it. So we utilize it sparingly. So the tools of apologetics that are so important, that are so relevant, that can be utilized, have to be utilized very sparingly, because the ultimate focus becomes the focus on being a witness, the focus on being redemptive. And all the tools are brought to bear on that particular enterprise, as long as they bring about that redemptive purpose to pass in the life of the person with whom we are communicating. So that's what I mean by the built-in limitations of apologetics, and being conscious of apologetics as an activity, being conscious of apologetics as an endeavor that we undertake.
You know, Finney, as you're speaking right now, it makes me think of a few things, and it's interesting because I preached a sermon on 1 Peter 3:15, and I think people were expecting me to go the route of using these different arguments, but essentially the way it's built in is, Peter's talking to the dispersed church who is suffering, right? And he's telling them to give an answer for the hope, who is Jesus.
Right.
And so it seems to me that that's the way it should have always gone, but somewhere down the line, it went down the route of mere speculation, which is okay as long as you said, it's ministerial, not magisterial. Now that makes me think of something else then too, because if we're dealing here, not if, but since we're dealing here with the notion of truth, but also it seems that as we're engaging these different philosophical worldviews, there's a presupposition behind each one of them. And so whether we're using rationality or scientific argument, philosophical arguments, it seems that, and I could be wrong here, but it seems that we're going to have to go down the route of possibly using some form of presuppositional apologetic, not necessarily in isolation too, but as that groundwork that defangs the other things. I don't know if that would be fair to say in terms of the limitations that you're speaking about. Would you say something like that or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think presuppositional apologetics is a very vital tool in our apologetic endeavors. In fact, Reformed epistemology which obviously was spearheaded by Plantinga and Walter Storff and a couple of other people, really picks up from presuppositional apologetics. And there are a lot of parallels. Of course, Reformed epistemology is conducted in the context of analytic philosophy, so it becomes very technical. But presuppositional apologetics is very, very important for the very reason that facts don't interpret themselves. There are certain pre-commitments, there are certain presuppositions, there are certain assumptions that we constantly make. And the problem is not all assumptions can be identified, which is why people don't think about their thought life or their thought patterns as being based on assumptions, because we don't identify assumptions immediately, and we don't necessarily identify all the assumptions. And even if identified, we don't know what the regulative power of each assumption is. So it's a very, very complex issue. But you're right, presupposing a lot of things really provides the framework and the foundation on which we believe, on which we build beliefs, and on which we have what we would call warranted assertability, on which we base certain propositions that we attach truth value to. And so it's very interesting because it's not just in apologetics. It's not that the apologist comes to the task with presuppositions or pre-commitments. Everybody does. And that's the whole point of presuppositionalism and Cornelius Van Til and a couple of the other guys who were involved in this venture. Everybody, by virtue of being a human being, by virtue of being a human person, by virtue of being an epistemic agent, you're already presupposing a lot of things. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And so the regulative power of presuppositions then becomes very, very important. In fact, even if you look at all the disciplines in the academy, what I really like to call cultures, because I don't like the term discipline, it seems overarching and it seems too comprehensive. If you look at all the cultures in the academy, science and math and history and philosophy and theology and literature, you see that all of the disciplines, even mathematics at the foundational level, presupposes certain things. They're very axiomatic. And axiomatic or presuppositions or assumptions, things that you take to be true, but you cannot prove it within the system. And so presuppositions are very natural. They're very intrinsic to our humanity. And so when we go that route, when you point those things out to people, then we will be able to make sense of not only the arguments that they put forward, but why they hold on to certain arguments and not others. So presuppositions really opens up that avenue of discussion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think also, like, even when you look at things happening in the culture today, I think people often forget that they come to any situation, they come to the interpretation of any situation with already, founded ideas and already supplanted foundations. And so even when I see like a news source or something saying we provide unbiased reporting or unbiased, interpretation, I think to myself, well, there's no such thing. I mean, if you have a proper grounded perspective on human nature and human reason and the nature of epistemology, you immediately recognize that, like you said, there is no unbiased human. And so you might as well just come out and say, hey, listen, I'm a conservative. I'm going to look at everything through a conservative lens. This is how it is. Or I'm a progressive. I'm going to look at everything through a progressive lens. And so, yeah, I think human beings by definition are biased. And which actually, interestingly, brings me to another point. And this is another area that you and I have talked about a little bit, is the distinction that you make between reason and rationality. And how does that influence apologetics and even, what Carlos talked about earlier and how you approach something specifically? How does that distinction help us in any practical way?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. So ever since the Enlightenment, as we're all aware, there was not just a chronological change, but a substantial change in terms of some fundamental ideas that we used to hold on to during the medieval and the Renaissance. And one of the changes that happened is this whole concept of the rational, and making that concept very concrete. How did that happen? It happened obviously by way of Descartes, who came up with this methodological doubt and the foundation of knowledge in terms of his mind and his thoughts. And then that was translated into the vehicle of science. and the language of mathematics, because they were seen as these objective disciplines that can sustain and provide that rational center for any kind of discourse that we're involved in within the academy and within culture. And that's a very quick overview of what happened during the Enlightenment. But the main point is this: we made the concept of the rational very concrete, very concrete. It became so concrete that what was rational, what was delivered by the sciences, what was delivered by mathematics as rational, was seen as something that was very objective. When you say that a particular proposition is rational, it means that it's an all things considered, holistic perspective without anything left behind. It's a total view of the totality of facts and the arrangement within your cognitive structure. So it gives that particular proposition an ultimate status when something is rational. And the dictum of the Enlightenment was to achieve the rational. And how do you achieve it? Through science, and especially through math, the language of science. And so this was the particular view of what it means to be rational. And then obviously, if that's the case, and the exact sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, along with the language of science, mathematics, delivered what is rational, then everything else was less than rational. Everything else was less than what the sciences could deliver or what mathematics could deliver. And so you see the split between the exact sciences and the humanities or the social sciences, these lesser disciplines that involve human emotion and other presuppositions and pre-commitments that the sciences and the mathematics transcend. These are purely objective disciplines and so on. But I think the proper way to think about it is not in terms of if things are rational, but in terms of whether things are reasonable. So how do I really come to see a belief as rational? Is it a status that a belief exemplifies or achieves? If I come to believe that something is rational, it really seems to happen by a process of accumulated reasonable moments. Moments in which I perceive a belief to be reasonable and to be increasing in value on the reasonability spectrum till it reaches a pre-established threshold for attaining the status of being rational. That's how it seems to happen. But the problem is that threshold is never reached. When we say that something is rational, it's a mere arbitrary limit ultimately erected to sustain a particular structure that motivates particular kinds of discourses and solidifies particular kinds of domains. Now, that's a mouthful. What do I mean by that? It means that in everyday discourse, whether we're doing academic discourse or regular social discourse, we only see things as being rational. In other words, we accept things on a spectrum of reasonability, where we see certain things as being acceptable, as being warranted up to that particular point. And then we accumulate these moments of warrant till that belief or that particular proposition reaches that level of being reasonable to us. And it continues to be reasonable without ever reaching that spectrum of the rational, because we never get to the all things considered objective view of things. And so when we maintain the distinction between the reasonable and the rational, because the reasonable is true enough, the rational tries to get to a one-to-one correspondence between what we know and what is true, which is almost impossible. Then we see the kind of humility we need to exemplify in our discourses, and especially when we're talking about a lot of these issues from an apologetic standpoint.
I think also I'm trying to guide this conversation in a way so we can help some of our listeners understand. I think even Western philosophy and kind of its historical sort of foundation for rationality assumes that there are certain inalienable truths that can be grasped. It can be grasped, and sometimes particularly through science or sometimes particularly through mathematics, but it still presumes that these are, in a sense, empirically verifiable. But the question for you, and you tell me this, I'm asking this out of just a pure curiosity, would you still say that reasonability is opposed to something like empiricism, for example, where it's not about the actual intellectual truths that can be grasped as much as what can be sensed or what can be experienced. Do you think that rationality is the exact opposite of empiricism, or do you think reasonability stands somewhere in between that?
I think it stands somewhere in between that because it really draws from various intimations of reality. See, there are certain things that the rationalists got right, and there are certain things that the empiricists got right. And
Right.
so reasonableness pulls together from the various intimations of reality and integrates them into a comprehensive vision, which is not necessarily objective. And so we do get a comprehensive vision when we're reasonable, without it being completely or purely objective. But it pulls together from these various strands, these various schools of thought, and really brings to us a comprehensive vision. Yeah.
Right.
In saying this, I'm just thinking of we took a class with Dr. Kevin Lewis, and he's a lawyer, and you mentioning reasonability and rationality. Um, and then you mentioned the threshold level. In speaking of reasonableness, would it
Mm,
be a way to help our listeners understand this, that there are degrees of reasonability
right.
or the level at which something must be reached? Let's say, for example, in tort law, they have the probability and the gravity and the responsibility for us to figure, yeah, it's beyond the reasonable
Beyond a
doubt,
reasonable doubt
but
standard, right?
not beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt, which is completely different and it's not the standard for criminal law. Would that be a way to help our listeners understand something like this?
Oh, yeah, yeah. In terms of being reasonable, there is a spectrum. And the reasonableness of a belief does increase. And that is why, for instance, in the sciences, we do experiments. We look at certain concepts, we look at certain theories, and we refine them. When we refine them, the reasonability spectrum increases because we're gaining more knowledge and there is more things being accumulated. There is more things being verified through experimentation and through observation. Now, the problem comes in when this refinement is seen in terms of being purely objective. That's where the problem comes in. But if it's seen as this limited discourse where we are trying to make sense of reality, where we're trying to bring together observation, experimentation to really accumulate the needed knowledge to be reasonable in our deductions and so on, I don't think that's an issue. But when you see the whole enterprise as geared towards achieving objectivity, and when you're convinced that objectivity is something that can be achieved because of the methodology that you're using or because of the language of mathematics, so that you can get to that standpoint where you're purely rational, then that becomes a problem. But in terms of reasonableness, yeah, there is accumulation of knowledge and evidence and so on, and which is part of the reason why we in apology, so that they can see their beliefs as being reasonable.
Yeah, that's an excellent question that Carlos asked, and that actually makes me think. Um, when we think about reasonability, would you say that there is this exists somewhere in the intersection of let me rephrase that. So I'm talking specifically about scientism. Okay, so
Right.
scientism seems to be a field where there is this kind of like undeniable sort of standard. I mean, scientism is a worldview. I get that, but I
Right.
also think, and I think you guys will agree with me that the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed a couple of things. Number one, it's exposed the weaponization of the scientific worldview, but I also think it has exposed a credibility problem. And would you say that we have that the worldview of scientism has kind of hit the brick wall of reasonability, or does this actually just merely expose sort of the impossible standards of objectivity that every agency like the CDC or something like that is trying to accomplish without enough of the metrics to look at it from a reasonable perspective?
Yeah, so I think it has exposed the rationalistic bent within the scientific enterprise. And so scientism, first of all, is rationalistic. Secondly, it's reductionistic. And so it has really exposed some of these built-in limitations and shown science to be what it is. It's an activity of particular culture, and it's an artifact of that culture. And so science is something that we do. It's not something that falls from the sky. It is not something that sort of appears out of the blue. Science is something that we do. And science is an activity of human beings. And science is a culture that is formed by people who end up speaking the same vocabulary. And over a period of time, that vocabulary is institutionalized and unfortunately made objective. And we erect an expert culture within that vocabulary, and they are the experts in talking about, objects and quantities and entities within that particular frame of reference. And that's how the whole narrative of science progressed. And I think some of the limitations and some of the blunders that were made, not only with COVID-19, but in many other areas, shows the built-in limitations and the intrinsic nature of science that is less comprehensive than we have supposed it to be. It's an activity of human beings. And so to make it overreaching, to make it something that is objective, is entirely beyond the scope of what it was supposed to do. Now, a lot of these things come to the fore when you look at something very simple. Let me just give you an example of what I mean. Let's say that you see a particular event. Let's say a person takes his or her life. Now, there are different ways in which we can explain that particular event, different dimensions that converge and coalesce. So at the purely physical level, at the level that science investigates, we can see that person as a collection of atoms, as empty space between those atoms. And let's say the person used a gun or a knife, we can see the trajectory of the bullet or the force of the knife that was utilized, whatever it is. We can look at everything from a purely physical standpoint and give purely physical explanations or form purely physical explanatory models. That is one level. But beyond that, we can look at it from a social standpoint. You see, the social standpoint presupposes the physical but transcends it. So now when you look at it from a social standpoint, you look at the whole concept of suicide, you look at the whole concept of someone murdering him or herself, and whether it's acceptable within the current social context and what were different social contexts in history and so on. So you can look at it from a historical standpoint, from a social standpoint. But the main point is this: the social presupposes a physical and rises above it, transcends it. Then you can look at it from a moral standpoint. You can ask whether this act, this particular thing that this individual did, whatever the reason might be, whether it was moral, whether it was immoral. We can look at it from a moral standpoint. But the moral standpoint presupposes and transcends not only the physical, but also the social. And so you got the moral standpoint. And then finally, we can look at it from a spiritual standpoint in terms of this person being made in the image of God. And then you look at the eternal destiny of this person, what's going to happen to the soul of this person, all of the things that we usually talk about from a spiritual standpoint. And the main point is this: the spiritual standpoint presupposes the physical, the social, and the moral, and transcends it. So you've got this richness of the various dimensions that converge and coalesce in human life. The problem comes in when one particular level says, this is the only level at which explanatory models should be issued. This is the only level of explanation. And that's where the problem comes in. And that's where science becomes scientism. And it does injustice to the abundance of reality by reducing everything to physical relations. And so that's where the reductionism and the rationalism and the scientism comes in. And it does a lot of injury to our understanding of the world, ourselves, God, transcendent realities, things beyond the purview of science.
Right. It also, going back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, you were talking about how sometimes when you're within these kinds of walled boundaries, it creates an echo chamber. It creates what's the term? Confirmation bias, right? When you're constantly surrounded by the same kind of thing. But again, confirmation bias is not limited only to the scientific field. It happens in academia. It happens in the church. It happens everywhere, right? And so this, again, I think completely brings to front and center the case that we were making earlier, that all people are predisposed to this. Carlos, you were about to say something. Go ahead and say it.
As we're thinking about this, I just thought of this because we're talking about objectivity, science, scientism, worldview, and the whole idea how this was weaponized. Now, I wonder what your thoughts are on this in terms of us living in a postmodern, post-truth culture. in which the ones who hold the microphone are the ones who determine what is right. So basically, right is by might. How do we see the academy? Are they being, I don't want to say objective, but are they following, if you will, the evidence where it leads, or are they also merely being dragged by this cultural current that we see in which people can't speak the truth? So, because we're speaking about objectivity and getting to a certain reasonableness, um, are you seeing any of this kind of because this whole idea with the COVID issue is it wasn't scientific, it was post-normal science. It wasn't really scientific at all in that sense, and it's the abuse of it. Are we seeing that the ability of this truth is not wanting to be shown because we're dealing more with a power structure? Or what did we see in the academy with
Yeah.
this, all this involved?
Yeah. I mean, there are always power structures in place. There are always financial institutions in place. There are ideological features in place. There is no pure academic venture, no matter what discipline you look at. We are human beings. We are epistemic agents. I mean, we're not even pure epistemic agents. What do we mean by epistemic agency? We talk as if we are these units of epistemic measurement that somehow look at things from a pure standpoint of reason or rationality or knowledge, and we form deductions and conclusions. No, we are an intermix of so many things that we can identify, and many things are beyond identification. Like I said earlier, certain assumptions are not even identifiable, and then their regulative power is sometimes not identified at all. And so a human person, individually and collectively, is an accumulation and is a coalescence of so many factors. And a lot of these factors are what I call unarticulated constituents. They're unarticulated, but they're still constituents of our humanity. And so they affect and influence and frame and configure our ways of knowing. And that's not a bad thing, but it can become a bad thing when the ideological and the political and the financial become part and parcel of that pursuit. And we don't need to look far. All we need to do is look at the Enlightenment and look at how science was magnified by being institutionalized. So the objectivity of science, and we can get into it a little bit later if we want to, the objectivity of science is an institutionalized objectivity. There is nothing intrinsic to the sciences. There is nothing intrinsic to the scientific method. There is nothing intrinsic to mathematics that renders it objective or more objective than any other discipline. The objectivity is purely institutional. And so all these factors, people who are in power, might makes right, all these things converge and coalesce in our everyday living. One of the things that I often talk about is in physics. One of the theories that is often pursued is string theory, and we're all familiar with it. And it's a very simple undertaking to really bring together the world of gravity and the world of quantum mechanics, the macro world and the micro world. But you see, string theory, and there is not one theory, there are hundreds of theories. String theory or theories by themselves are really actually not science, because there is no experimental verification for string theory. It's a very elegant mathematical theory. There are other theories like quantum gravity that we should be pursuing. And the question is, why don't we pursue those? Why are we only pursuing string theory? Well, when you really dig into it, you see that it goes beyond science. There are certain ideological features, there are certain pre-commitments to atheism and to a godless universe that makes us pursue string theory at the expense of other things. So why do we pursue string theory? It's because it affords a theory, a purely scientific mathematical theory that leaves God out of the equation, because everything is configured within that theory without any transcendental causes or transcendental powers or God in the equation. And that's one of the motivating forces for some of these scientists pursuing string theory. So we can multiply example upon example of all these factors, these political factors, ideological factors, and so on. And so there is no way to separate knowledge, whether it's scientific or anything else, completely and purely from all of these factors. Unfortunately, as human beings, we are part and parcel of and the accumulation and the integration of a lot of these factors. And so it becomes a little muddy, especially in the social context. When you see things on the news, when you hear certain theories, when you hear certain positions, you take it as purely academic because that's how it's presented. But we as Christians need to be aware that there's a lot of ideology there's a lot of political motivation, and there's a lot of people who are in places of power and places of position of influence and so on, who are navigating these dialogues and navigating these narratives in a particular direction. And so we need to be vigilant. We need to be watching out for those things.
No, I
That's
think
really good.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I also think, like you said, these abstract, we're drawn to these abstract models because they provide incentive structures for power dynamics. And you see
Right.
that being weaponized even through like language, right? We see this in
Right.
linguistics all the time, especially on the
Right.
progressive left with the usage of like
Right.
euphemisms. So instead of like
Right.
saying, abortion, they'll say women's rights, because now it's
Right.
become a
Right.
euphemism. Now you've restructured the whole metric, and anybody who now stands against that, you say, oh, so you don't care about women, right? So this is exactly what it is. You're recreating the
Right.
model, you're rigging it basically to
Right.
support certain
Right.
predisposed ideas. It's very interesting because I was seeing a couple of years ago when Facebook got into some hot water with having to go before Congress
Mhm.
and things like that, and even Twitter with Jack Dorsey and all these guys got into a little bit of hot water because they were in some violation of some particular incentive structure that the government was producing, and their argument was essentially, well, we're not publishers, we're platforms. We're platforms. We're just it's just a level playing field. We allow everybody. So like Zoom,
Right.
right? We're on Zoom right now. And so Zoom, it would be like Zoom saying, yeah, we're just a platform. And so if you or me or Carlos said something inflammatory or something like politically or socially inappropriate or something like that, Zoom cannot be held accountable for that because they are
Right.
a platform. But that's not what Facebook and Twitter were doing, right? People are saying things on there, and these guys would cherry pick and say, well, we like what Finney's saying, but we don't like what Prashanth is saying. Okay. And so we're just
Right.
going to edit that out. Well, as soon as you put your hands on this, you are no longer a platform, right? You're a publisher, right? And so,
Right.
so for example, all of us have ministries here, and it is up to our discretion what we want to put on the ministry. And we're not a
Right.
platform; we're publishers. But when
Mm.
you put this veneer of objectivity and then you rig it, you mess with the metrics and things like that to produce
Right.
a predisposed outcome. Now
Right.
you have these sort of models that are incentive structures for that. So,
Right.
Carlos,
Right.
you look like you were about to say
Yeah.
something.
No.
Yeah, it just makes
Yeah.
me think of Greg Bonson's line, there is no neutrality, right? It's the fallacy of
Right.
neutrality, and we
Right.
tend to buy it,
Right.
and that's
Right.
so true, we all come with a particular bent, and it reminds me
Right.
of when I was in nursing school and my professor said, we don't need a Christian or a Catholic to be teaching the religion section or the spirituality section of the holistic nature of nursing. We need an atheist because they're neutral. I'm thinking, wait a minute, buddy. No, there's no neutrality there. That guy's coming at it from an anti-theist position.
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, there is no neutrality.
Yeah. And the great myth of the Enlightenment was that such neutrality was not only possible, but actual. And that neutrality was rendered in scientific and in mathematical language. And when that became the ideal, then what happened? In the academy, everyone wanted to gain credibility by becoming more quote unquote scientific. And that started even with Auguste Comte, with the father of sociology. He brought sociology within the topology of physics. And then when you look at psychology, you look at B.F. Skinner. What did B.F. Skinner do in Beyond Freedom and Dignity? He took personality and externalized it. Why? Because when you externalize personality in terms of behavior formats, then now that becomes a science. That becomes something that science can study because it's observable. So the psyche was kind of redefined and reordered in psychology. And so every discipline, when you look at history, when you look at theology, what happened in liberalism? Theology was made into a science by taking out all those factors that was supernatural. And so you naturalize the entire book, you naturalize the Bible so that it's made something that is acceptable within the academy. So everything had to be scientific in order to be credible, in order to be acceptable, because the sciences were the ideal. They were the dominant philosophy, and they were the dominant structure or discipline that navigated all the other disciplines. And you only had credibility to the extent that you were scientific enough. And so it's a very, very unfortunate consequence of the Enlightenment. And I think we lost sight of the nature of the comprehensiveness and the abundance of human life and of existence in general. And so it's a very unfortunate thing. Now, latching on to that concept is this. See, we have looked at history from the standpoint of rationality, but the question that needs to be asked is this: have we looked at rationality from the standpoint of history? In other words, is reason or rationality, is it a faculty or is it a concept? That's something that we need to grapple with in terms of apologetics, and how we render these arguments and how we help people to really understand some of these things.
It's interesting that you bring up B.F. Skinner, because B.F. Skinner's model is what all these tech companies are using with their incentive structures that are built into the way you use the technology interface and things like that. You know, the
Right.
way the reward system basically for
Right.
how and
Right.
how you click on things and move through their incentive structures. I want to move very quickly to our last segment before we go into the break, but we probably can't spend more than 10 minutes on this section. But Finney, I know this is an area that you've actually done some work in, is in the field of transhumanism and posthumanism. And I
Right.
think there's connections there with the scientific worldview and things like that that we've been talking about. And essentially, this is kind of the redefining of anthropology, right? And so give us a very quick, small definition of what transhumanism is. And then I just want to spend a few minutes chewing on that for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go into our break. What is transhumanism and posthumanism?
Yeah. So transhumanism is a transitional state between being a human and becoming post-human. So transhumanists will point out to all the technology we have right now by which we extend ourselves. For instance, your phone, your computer, all the tools that you use is an extension of yourself. Without those things, your built-in limitations as a human person would be intact. But with them, you can extend yourself beyond time and space. And so that's the transhumanist trend. And so they show that we are progressing on to this mode of existence, which we would call the post-human. We would begin using these technological features, and we would begin merging with these technological features, whether it's through being a cyborg or whether it's replacing body parts with machines, whatever it is. It's not just utilizing these machines, utilizing these tools, but we ourselves become part and parcel of these tools. In other words, the transhumanist says that the difference between a human person and the technological architecture that we're oversaturated by is not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree. You are just a more complex technological unit yourself. And during this transhuman stage, we're going to go through this process. And when we come out of this process, we're going to be post-human. And that is a very, very radical idea of the future, of this utopia that they want to build, because ultimately what they really want to do is download consciousness. Obviously, there are many, many issues we can talk about that just on that particular issue, but downloading consciousness into different machines so that you can exist for 300, 400, 500 years. Because the transhumanist and the posthumanist sees the physical body, the physical embodiment as problematic. So if you can remove the physical components one by one and replace them with the technological components, then we overcome our limitations, we overcome our humanity, so to speak, and we become post-human. And they say that this is the final stage of the evolutionary cycle, that we become
So
post-human.
would you say then that transhumanism crosses a line, like it moves from the sphere of human adaptability into human advancement? Because
Right.
what I mean by that is, when you actually look at our history, we actually have greatly benefited by technology. And so
All right.
when you
Yeah.
look at like war veterans, right, or
Mm.
prosthetics, and like glasses, right? Carlos is wearing glasses. I wear glasses. These are technological things that can, in one sense, are extensions of ourselves, but they adapt. They help us adapt to live in a fallen world with the atrophy of the human body and things like that. When events or incidents happen to us, we have the technology that helps us to cope in a fallen
Right.
world. And prosthetics is a great example of this. You lose a limb and you have bionic implants and hearing aids and cochlear implants and things like that. These are all, I would say, are probably embryonic stages, the embryonic stage of transhumanism. But that still only has to do with human adaptability. What you're saying is that transhumanism is not happy, is not satisfied with just adaptability, but at the
Right.
bottom, at the core of it, is this intrinsic idea that the human state as it is today is flawed and it can be better,
Right.
right? Isn't that the driving force behind
Right.
saying we need to go to the next evolutionary model here?
Right. And the main thing is, you mentioned you wearing glasses and so on. And of course, technology is very helpful, right? We can't deny the benefits of technology. But see, there is a difference between technological features and gadgets and environments helping us in terms of our natural propensities and natural abilities. So, for instance, your eyesight is affected, you're not able to see things at a distance or things nearby. Your natural ability that you have lost is enhanced by the glasses that you wear. But the problem comes in when you're given unnatural abilities by the technological advancements that are going on around us. So, for instance, when you create bionic men and bionic women, when you create or when you do prenatal genetic enhancements, when you start to tinker with the genetic code. I mean, these are unnatural things that are made possible because of technological advancements. So we need to be very careful about that distinction between natural abilities that are enhanced or natural abilities that are helped out by technological tools and gadgets, and unnatural abilities that are introduced because of these gadgets. For instance, the vision of the post-humanist, people like Bostrom and so on, talk about it. I mean, they really do discuss these things, that human beings can live for 400, 500 years. That's not a natural consequence of being a human person. And especially from a biblical standpoint, that was never meant to be. And so when technology moves in that direction, then it not only becomes dangerous, it becomes very destructive.
I actually agree with you, but I wonder if the transhumanist would push back and say, well, it's not about natural or unnatural as much as it is
Right,
about um, degree of sophistication. So
right,
the transhumanist would, I don't think the transhumanist actually cares about the
right,
word natural in their vocabulary as much as they want to say,
right,
yeah, we think the eye we can be restored to what it is naturally able to do, but can it do more? And now you're
right,
talking about things like augmented reality and virtual
right,
reality. And what if we gave the
right,
human eye the ability to optical zoom 20x, or
right.
infrared or X-ray? That's what the transhumanist would say, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's exactly what they would say. And this is where what Carlos mentioned earlier in terms of presuppositions, things come into clear view. The transhumanists, the posthumanists would say that because they don't have a proper definition of what it means to be human.
Exactly
In
right.
fact, they have a very fluid definition of what it means to be human. What it means to be human is whatever you're defined at that moment, and that definition is always open for revision because there is nothing undergirding, there is no foundation, there is no proper fulcrum on which everything else shifts. Right? I
Well,
mean,
I
there
would
is nothing that holds it together.
I would even go as far as to say they might even think they I think they would even have a problematic view of what it means to be human, is to say
Yeah.
that there is some sort of intrinsic insufficiency or deficiency in humanity that needs to be rectified, and it is up to them to be able to do that.
Right, right. Because they don't have any intrinsic definition of human nature, human
Right.
value, human dignity, because everything is in a state of flux. It's very fluid. And this is where presuppositions come in. And why do we have that counter perspective? It's because we have a different foundation from which we come at the whole thing. And our foundation is scripture. Now, there is no rational way to show that our foundation is superior. And this is where I think sometimes in rational apologetics, in evidential arguments, we make the mistake because we think that it's all about being rational enough or somehow showing them that one position is rationally more viable than another. The problem is all evidence is internal and inferential, right? The kind of weight that you assign to evidence within your epistemic structure really depends on what sort of epistemology you subscribe to. And so it's never a purely rational debate. There is no
Mm,
such thing as a purely rational
that's right.
debate. There is no such thing as a purely rational apologetic venture or encounter. So, how do we appeal to the transhumanists? How do we appeal to the posthumanists? It's got to go beyond or transcend mere rationality. And so that's where the discussion or the dialogue begins.
This seems to me almost like to take us back to the garden, right? Where humanity wants to become the God of God, and basically they're dissatisfied with what they have, and they feel that God is not giving them. In this case, they don't believe in God, right? And so you
Right,
see this almost even almost as you go forward into history, this Gnostic idea where the body's not good, so we need to be
right,
liberated from it so that we can
right.
escape. Back then it was spiritual, right? Now it's going to be cyborg, RoboCop, Terminator. And even as you were
Right.
talking about this, I thought of that Johnny Depp movie Transcendence, and that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
It,
Yeah.
it's almost like it's a sort of redefined or repackaged Docetism, right? This idea that there's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
intrinsically problematic with the flesh, and we need to transcend it and replace it with
Yeah.
technology.
Yeah. But that brings us back to a very fundamental question. The question to be asked is, why is it that during this post-human era, why is it that Christianity is being moved to the periphery while Eastern philosophies are being embraced? New Age philosophies are being embraced because at the core, they're saying the same thing. And that's the important point. So post-humanists, transhumanists do talk about the human problem. They do talk about salvation, but in very different terms. So the human problem is not sin, it is limitation. It is ignorance. It is inability to achieve your true potential. What does Eastern philosophy say? Starting from Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, and so on. The problem is not sin. The problem is, in a Sanskrit term, it's called avidya, ignorance. The problem is lack of knowledge. The problem is your limitation because you have identified yourself with this relative unit. You have
That's right.
identified yourself with all these categories that people have foisted upon you. And the post-humanists, the transhumanists are saying almost the same thing. They're saying your identity is not in this relative mode of existence that you have in terms of your physical embodiment. You can have this universal existence being merged into this stream of digital consciousness. And so it's very similar to Eastern philosophy. And these guys dialogue together and they have very similar ends, very similar goals, very similar philosophical outlooks.
Mm.
And so, Eastern philosophy really offers some of the philosophical impetus and some of the philosophical grounding for some of these ideas. And that's why even during this post-human era, Eastern philosophies are still being celebrated.
Wonderful, guys. Oh my gosh, this is super interesting. We could go so much deeper into this, but we are going to go ahead and take a break. Obviously, I want to discuss a lot more about this. We've been talking about a lot of very abstract, very heady stuff. And in the next segment after the break, I want to try to bring it down a little bit
Yes.
and make it a little bit more practical. And what does this mean for the believer? And what does this mean, especially, for the Christian church and for those of us who are doing ministry and things like that. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the Reasonable Truth podcast. We are in conversation here with Carlos Pamplona and my good friend Finney Premkumar. We've been having a very, very vibrant conversation on all kinds of interesting issues like the scientific worldview and redefining anthropology and transhumanism and posthumanism and the effects of the Enlightenment. And man, we've been kind of all over the place with a lot of very interesting issues, but with deep worldview ramifications. And Finney, in this segment, I want you to help bring this down a little bit for our listeners and help us to kind of to follow the breadcrumbs to a more practical, explanation of how all these things fit together. So let's begin with, obviously we've talked about philosophy, we've talked about worldview, we've talked about a lot of ideological stuff. And I would say that the Christian church today is in a little bit of trouble, especially when it comes to the realm of ideas. And I think a lot of churches are kind of out of touch and are not. They don't have the finger on the pulse of what is happening around them, especially in the field of ideas and things like this. So, what would you say? How would you say that the Christian church could reinvigorate the life of the mind, or just get better at being more, what's the term, maybe cognitively present, or intellectually present with what's happening in terms of all these tectonic shifts that are happening around us today?
Yeah. So the church, unfortunately, has been isolated and insulated for a long time. And we cannot afford to do that anymore. Because if we're going to preach the gospel, if we're going to share the truth about Christ and the biblical truth to this culture around us, we need to be conversant with the dominant philosophies that navigate culture. Because we need to find those points of contact where the gospel can make sense to them. And we have to translate the truth of the content of the Word of God in the idioms of contemporary times. And we cannot do that unless we understand contemporary times. And so this requires a couple of things. First of all, we've got to be a student of Scripture. That's the foundation. Become a student of Scripture. Secondly, become a student of culture. Keep one eye on the Scriptures, keep another eye on the culture, and see the trends, see the dominant philosophies, see the ideas, see the different schools of thought that are navigating culture. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need this to happen in the pulpit so that it can filter down to the pew.
That's
It
exactly
always
right.
begins with the pulpit. Yeah, we need pastors who are trained in these things. We need pastors who are aware, pastors who are cognizant of what is going on in culture so that they can teach, so that they can equip their congregations to be involved in this particular venture so that it's productive in the economy of the kingdom. And then the third thing we need to understand, which is very important, is this. When we isolate and insulate ourselves from the rest of culture, it brings about a generational gap. That generational gap is already there in most churches, unfortunately. So what happens? The older generation has their own particular group that they kind of spend time with, and they are pretty much far removed from a lot of things that happen in culture. Doesn't affect them as much. But the younger generation is immersed in culture. They spend more time out there than in the home or in the church. And what happens? They get immersed in this culture, they develop their own vocabularies, they get into this bubble, as it were. And when they come back home, when they come back to the church, they seem to live in a completely different world. And I hear parents constantly telling me, I don't understand my son or my daughter or my grandchildren. They're talking a different language, as it were. They're in a different world. They're in a bubble of their own. And that happened over a period of time because the church at all levels was not engaged with culture. And there's fragmentation that happens. There is a sense of a lack of trust, and there's a sense of breaking away of one generation from another. And it really makes the church less effective. And so some of the remedies need to happen immediately, as soon as possible. And so the other thing that we can do in terms of invigorating the church is to bring in teaching. We can have classes and courses that church members can take on a regular basis so that we inform them about the basics of Scripture, so that we inform them about these various cultural trends, so that we inform them about the various philosophies that are at play in culture in terms that are recognizable, in terms that are applicable to them. We don't need to get into all the specifics and all the details and all the technicalities of the philosophical discourses we're involved in, but make it practical, make it a resource or a tool that they can really understand and utilize in terms of being a witness in this culture. So there are a number of things we can do, and these are some of the things that I think we need to do right away.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was talking to a pastor just a couple of months ago, and he was I just had to shake my head and walk away from the situation because he was telling me that he was advising his congregation. He was actually he was feeling pretty good about it too. He was saying, I always tell my congregation, don't pay attention to the news, don't read what's happening in the culture, stay out of all of those things, just focus on the word of God and nothing else. Don't read anything else but Christian books. Basically he's saying, just keep your nose inside Christian theology. Don't worry about what's happening in the culture around you today. And even as he's saying that, I was thinking to myself, yeah, this is a train wreck happening in slow motion. This is not going to
Yeah.
help, and
Yeah.
this is how you are actually, you think you're doing your church a favor, and I don't think that's
Right.
going to help them at all. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's essentially your point. Carlos, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'm thinking, why do you think that there's such a bent against, I don't want to say intellectual, but I want to say the life of the mind, because it seems like everything is over spiritualized. And so apologetics should have never been a parachurch organization kind of a thing. It should have always been a thing within the church, as it will, a
That's
an arrow
exactly
within
right.
the quiver of everything that we do, right? So what are your thoughts? Why do you think there's such a pull, and we got to bring, obviously we got to bring it back. Why do you think we're there?
Yeah, because first of all, we have a very fragmented understanding of human nature, right? When the Bible talks about the heart, it's not talking about emotions bouncing about. It's talking about the comprehensive, fundamental person, the integrated person. And so we have not seen the mind as part and parcel of liturgical worship. The mind is part of discipleship. See, we bring our thoughts under the guidance and under the authority of Christ. That's what the Bible talks about.
That's right.
And so these things have not been emphasized. And so what happened was, especially in contemporary culture, where we are kind of moving along the lines of entertainment and emotional enhancement and really giving people the experience that we want, one of the real victims within the church of this consumeristic Christianity is the mind. We have moved into this realm of constantly being about activity, moving from one thing to another in the technologically saturated world, and the church has followed suit. And the moments of reflection, reflective attitudes, contemplative attitudes, things that involve deep thinking and really spending time on meditating, which the psalmist talks about, meditating not only on the word of God, but meditating on what it means for our world and what it means for a witness. All of these things are relics of the past because we're in this fast moving, going from one thing to another kind of culture, and the church has followed suit. And so we have not seen the mind as integrated in discipleship, in liturgical worship, as something that is part and parcel of growing in Christ. And we have not seen the meditative or the reflective life as something that is intrinsic to being human. And so we're constantly about movement and about going from one thing to another. And we need to settle down and really understand that we need to be still and know that He is God. And God can only speak to us in those moments of silence, in those moments when we disengage from the world. It's very interesting for me how Jesus, right? We read in the Gospels that Jesus constantly left the crowds, his disciples, and the hordes of people that followed him. Why did he do that? To spend time alone in the presence of the Father. To spend time alone in the presence of the Father. That's where the power is. That's where the reorientation is. And so, as Christians, there are times when we need to switch off the cell phones, unplug our iPods and our iPads, and completely bypass Facebook and other social networking sites. All these things that vie for our loyalties so that we can spend time alone in the presence of the Father, spend time alone in meditating upon His Word, spend time alone in reflecting and really using our minds to grasp the concepts that are in Scripture and applying them to the world. So, this meditative life, this intentional living, individually and communally, needs to happen within the church. We when we get together, right, in church fellowships, we talk about a lot of things. We talk about movies and we talk about sports, and none of these things are bad in and of themselves. But how often do we get to the deep questions of life, the deep things of life? It was John Wesley who once said, whenever I get into a discourse or a discussion with other people, I make every effort to speak about spiritual things. I make every effort to speak about spiritual things. And by spiritual things, he meant something very comprehensive. He meant, being reflective and thinking about the Word of God and how it applies to society, how it applies to reality. And so these are some of the things that need to become part and parcel of the regularities of the church. And these are things that, again, from the pastor to those in leadership, these are the things that need to be brought back as regular features of not only church service, but of church life, of the Christian communal life. And so these are the things that will reorient us.
Even as you were talking, Finney, it reminded me of 2 Corinthians 10:5, right, where it talks about take every false pretension, every argument that sets
Right.
itself up against God, subject it to the obedience of Christ. And I think that is an area that the church has not done well. But I also think the church has kind of become a victim of the shifting sands of culture as well. So, we talked about this at the conference, as Charles Taylor, the philosopher, Canadian philosopher's
Right.
prognosis of the mimetic worldview and the poetic worldview, and how there's a very clear shift that is happening toward the poetic. And Carl Trueman talks about this in his book as well. And so and I think this kind of poison has kind of bled its way into the church as well, probably to a certain extent, because you're seeing the scales kind of tilting a little bit, even from rationalism down. It's getting heavier now on the empiricistic side, and where there's a lot of emphasis on a person's experience or lived experience, for example, as opposed to objective reality and objective facts and objective truth. And this is not a new phenomenon, but I think it's really starting to pick up now. And would you say this is also contributing to one of the problems with the church not having a good grasp on the life of the mind? It's not so much that they've completely given up on it, as much as they're really embracing the emotional, the esoteric, that kind of experience.
Right, right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And even before we get to the church, within culture, postmodernism was a critique of the totalizing view of science. And not all postmodernists are atheists. Not all postmodernists believe that truth does not exist. It was essentially a critique of this narrative that said that science had the final vocabulary on things. And so what that did was really do away or minimize the emotional, minimize the experiential, because these were seen, again, from a disciplinary standpoint as part and parcel of the social sciences or the humanities, lesser of the disciplines in the academy. And so when a movement reacts to that, it always goes to the extreme. And so with postmodernism, we have this whole notion of, okay, throw everything out of the door and, and just go with your feeling and go with your particular predispositions. And, there is no sense of essence. There is only the existential reality of what you define and definitions that are open to be redefined constantly. And so it's a reactionary movement. And in reactionary movements, they always go to the extremes. And so within the church, this has caught on. And everything is about the worship experience. Everything is about the church experience. Everything is like a Starbucks experience, right? You go in there and your need for that experience is met. And you come away saying, wow, that was a wonderful time of worship. That was a wonderful service. It felt so great. And, everything is reduced to that particular level. It's very interesting to me because, again, when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman by the well, she asks him, how do we worship God? Where do I find God? Some people say he's on this mountain. Other people say he's on that mountain. And what does Jesus say? Jesus positions the human heart as the place of worship because worship is coextensive with life. And then he says something very important that we often miss. He says, those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth.
That's right.
In spirit and in truth. Why did he say that? He said it because the Samaritans were a very spirited people. They were very spirited people, very emotionally engaged in worship, but they did it at the expense of truth. There was no truth in that worship, only spirited expression. Now, the Jews, on the other hand, were concerned about the truth, but they did not have the right spirit. They had a legalistic spirit. And so Jesus is saying worship is about spirit and truth. It's about expression, but more importantly, it's about submission. So as I submit to the truth of the content of the Word of God, which is cognitive as much as it is expressive, then I express these things in worship. So there is no worship of God. There is no discipleship. There is no spiritual formation. There is no church life. There is no Christian life. There is no Christian journey without submission to the truth of the content of the Word of God. And out of that submission comes the expression of worship. And so we have lost this comprehensive sense of worship. And worship has become mere expression and emotion. And those who can get an emotional high out of you are seen as the worship leaders of centers of worship. And that's a very unfortunate thing. That's a very dangerous thing. And so this comprehensive notion of the mind and the heart and the emotions, all of these things need to be integrated in the life of a Christian, because even when you're saved as a total person. Every aspect of you, every faculty of you, everything that converges and coalesces into what God has made you to be.
It almost makes me think of even the approach to evangelism, with the exception of discipleship, right? You say, hey, Jesus loves you, he died for you, and you leave it at that. And so it's all by grace through faith, which is true. But then he didn't save you to stay out there. He saved you from the world to come into the church, to be the church, and to, be part of the family. So it needs to seem the case that we need to start telling people, don't just do things for the sake of doing things. Do them because of
Right.
this reason. The indicative leads to the imperative. But we need to understand that we're not saved to be the secret service Christians, but we need to be
Right.
doing things because of what Christ has done we haven't pushed, I think, discipleship enough.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think that's
And,
exactly right.
and
Go ahead, Finney.
yeah. And when Christ saves us, it's not just a reorientation of behavior patterns. It's not just a reorientation of particular beliefs. It's a reorientation at the level of worldview. It's a reorientation at the most fundamental level, at the core of who you are. And so
Transformation.
it reorients you to the world. C.S. Lewis, actually following G.K. Chesterton, said, God is like the sun. You cannot look at it, but without it, you cannot look at anything else. And so what does that really mean? It means that God becomes the frame of reference. Till then, it was egocentric living. You were the frame of reference, but now you've been pushed to the periphery. And God, through the process of discipleship, becomes a frame of reference. And when he becomes a frame of reference, everything is framed from the standpoint of eternity. Everything is framed from the standpoint of his infinity. Everything is framed from beyond time and space. And so you have this eternal perspective, a perspective beyond the now, and to see all the nows in your life in the focus of that eternal perspective. And so it doesn't just change one particular belief or another. It doesn't just change one particular behavior or another. It changes you from the inside out, at the core of who you are, at the deepest levels of your existence. And so these are some of the things that we need to talk about within the church. And these are some of the things that we need to bring the dialogue back to.
Dr. Alistair McGrath, I think it's in his book, Mere Apologetics. He talks about this. He says that the Christian church seems to be a little surprised by the fact that, having been the bedrock of reason for so long, why isn't that approach being as effective in our current time and age today? And he talks about how that's because the sands of rationality have blown away. They're starting to continually blow away. And so then what do we do? I'm paraphrasing what he's saying. He doesn't say it. He says it much better than I am. But basically, he makes the argument that apologetics needs to take on a new sort of appeal. There needs to be a more imaginative apologetics that has an aesthetic sort of appeal. You know what quote I'm referring to, right? It's from his book, Mere Apologetics. Speak to that a little bit as we approach the end here, Finney.
Yeah, so just two things I'll mention. Let me just pick up on Alistair McGrath. I kind of ran with that, and I actually just wrote an article for one of the organizations in Canada that'll be released next month. And I basically talk about this fact that the problem with the world might not be that they are not reasonable enough. The problem with the world is not a lack of reason, but a lack of the imagination. So when we have this scientific singular vision of reality, when we reduce everything to the purely physical, we don't just become irrational, we become unimaginative. And so sometimes people are not able to understand God as creator. Sometimes people are not able to understand the hypostatic union. Sometimes people are not able to understand that miracles actually happen, not because they're not able to process it through their faculty of reason, but because they don't have the imaginative faculties that should have been in place. They've been stripped away of the imagination. And so when we talk about only rational things and reasonable things, we kind of short circuit the entire human narrative, and we don't do justice to the abundance of the human person and all these other faculties that converge and coalesce. And so the imaginative and the rational needs to be held in the right tension. And as we talked about it earlier, we talked about the rational, and we talked about looking at the concept of rationality from the standpoint of history. Let me filter some of the things that we talked about earlier and filter it into this particular illustration. So let's say you're a mom, you're a dad, you've been going to church for a long time, you bring your kids to church, they go to Sunday school, and they're pretty immersed in the word, and they enjoy Sunday school and so on. And then your kids go to high school, then they go to college. And one day your son or your daughter comes back from college, and they say after maybe 1 or 2 years in college, they tell you, Mom, Dad, I've gone to college, I've taken biology and physics and chemistry, and I can no longer believe that the Bible is rational. I can no longer rationally believe that God exists. What do we usually do? The immediate procedure or the immediate response is to sit them down, especially if you're involved in the apologetic field, if you've been exposed to apologetics, is to go through the arguments. That's the usual response. We look at them and we tell them, well, look at the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, the argument from experience, the argument from design, all of these things. And we build together cumulative case arguments. Now, I don't want to undermine the cumulative case argument. As I mentioned earlier, Richard Swinburne does a marvelous job, one of the best in terms of cumulative case arguments. And there is a place for cumulative case arguments. I don't want to dismiss them or be dismissive of them. But the problem is this: we have not gone down to the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue that we need to ask, the fundamental question that we need to ask is this: what concept of reason are you working with? That's what we need to ask that young person. That's what we need to ask culture. We don't have the same concept of reason. Now, for instance, if that young person has been indoctrinated, and that happens quite a bit, indoctrinated into believing that only physical things exist, that only observable things exist, that non-physical things are non-existent, that they're just fairy tales, then no amount of evidence, no amount of cumulative argument is going to convince them, because the issue is with the pre-commitment that they've made to things existing only if they're physical or observable. See, so we need to get to the heart of the issue, which is the pre-commitments and the pre-definitions of what is rational that this young person or anyone else has accepted. And we need to kind of flesh out some of those things, help them to understand that rationality is a concept that has gone through variations throughout human history, and that particular schools and philosophies have defined it and redefined it. And that particular influence is navigating how they view realities beyond what that particular navigational method allows for. And so we need to get to the fundamental issue, which is some of these concepts that are navigating young people and others who are involved in these ventures before we get to evidences and so on, cumulative case arguments and so on. So those two things need to be kept intact. And certain definitions of rationality leave out, as I said earlier, concepts of the imaginative. Again, the imaginative is seen as something that is not anchored to anything, that it's something that runs wild. But we really need to understand that the imaginative is as important as the rational. In fact, and I don't know if we have time to go through this, in fact, I would argue that the imaginative sets the boundaries for the rational. And it's not the rational that sets the boundaries for the imaginative, but the imaginative that sets the boundaries for the rational. In fact, Thomas, most popular and one of the most influential books written back in the 60s, really talks about this, that the structure of scientific revolutions does not happen. We don't go from one theory to another through a mere rational process. There are other elements involved, and the imaginative is part and parcel of them. Because rationality, as I mentioned earlier, keeps you constrained within a particular worldview. It's inferential and internal. It's the imaginative element that brings in the novel and introduces a new paradigm into which you step into, whether in a scientific perspective or in other ventures or domains of life.
Carlos, were you going to say something? We can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Oh, my button has some gremlins. I pushed it and it didn't go through. I actually agree with Finney. I think the imagination is key. We lose that as we move on through life, as we age, and even as we go through the school system. So I think that's right. And I was even thinking, as Finney was saying, that the pre-commitments that these students are making are the issue. And so it's almost reminded me of Francis Schaeffer's method at L'Abri. We need to have like mini L'Abris in our own churches where you teach the students how to go through this through the youth group and even make it part of the teaching, as you said before, in the church. It's very important. So yeah, I completely agree.
So, the kind of the takeaway for me just from the last, 10, 15 minutes of what we've been talking about is we need a combination of personalized discipleship along with an imaginative aesthetic appeal for evangelism and apologetics in terms of a methodology, right? And I think we can't just ride just ride the boat of reason alone, because the culture obviously is changing and shifting so much, and we need to be able to kind of not reinvent the wheel of Christian apologetics or even evangelism, but change our angle a little bit, so that we are able to be more effective and relevant. Which actually kind of brings us to the last segment, Finney. Um, for a lot of our listeners, I'm sure, and I'm sure I'm going to get some feedback about this. I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are going to probably think, "Man, this episode was really academic," right? So along those lines, let me ask you this question. I am of the conviction that academia needs the church and the church needs academia. How do
Yes.
we make that case, and why are those two deeply, deeply important for the Christian life?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. You see, even the most abstract ideas, even the most abstract of ideas in academia gets filtered down. Things I often ask parents who don't believe that is this. What is one word that your kids, especially if you have teenagers, what is one word that they use all the time? And almost every single time I ask that question, the parents say, whatever. Whatever, dad,
Whatever.
whatever, mom, whatever, and they just kind of walk away. The kids might not understand the deep philosophical attitudes that they are embodying and the postmodern structure that provides that attitude, but it filters down. It filters down in the media, it filters down into the music, it filters down into the movies that they watch, it filters down into the magazines that they read, it filters down into the Twitter feeds, it filters down into Facebook and all of the social media that surrounds us and saturates our lives. And so nothing in academia stays academic. Nothing.
Exactly right. That's right.
Nothing in academia stays academic. It filters down into the rest of culture in ways that you and I cannot even imagine,
This
ways
is
in
this
which we
is
cannot
also
even
one of the
identify.
reasons. Right. This is also one of the reasons why even bad ideas from academia are streaming down into culture today. It used to be about 20, 30, 40 years ago that academia was its own silo and the church was its own silo, and they were
Right,
all siloed off
right.
from each other. But with internet and social media now, all the gates have been flung open and everything is going in all kinds of
Right.
directions. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, just finish your thought.
Oh,
I
no,
just wanted to
no,
say
no.
that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, so it filters down into academia. It filters down into culture. If that is true, then the church needs to wake up and be vigilant to what is happening in terms of all these ideas coming down from academia and filtering down into the rest of culture. Because ideas, as Richard Weaver showed us many years ago, have consequences.
That's right.
Every idea has a particular consequence because it navigates culture in one direction or another. And every idea is imbued with a sense of meaning that renegotiates some of the fundamentals of what we believe, thereby renavigating culture. And the church has to be vigilant. And so the church really has to be involved. And apologetics is one way, one of the primary ways in which the church or people in the pew can learn some of these things that are happening in culture. And so apologetics becomes very important in the life of the church. And again, the leadership is very important. The pastorate, those who are in leadership, the elders of the church, in terms of really allowing or helping the church to understand some of these cultural trends and some of these ideas that are filtering in from academia. And so the apologetic task, the task of the apologists, the apologetic movements, the apologetic courses, the apologetic sessions, the apologetic sermons, all of these things should help the church to understand this particular phenomenon, because we kind of dismiss it at our own peril. So that's the first thing, from academia to culture. Now, what does a church have to do with academia? Well, the church has to be involved in the conversations that happen within academia. How does it happen? It happens by people in the church taking up places and positions of influence within academia. You see, unfortunately, and Prashanth, you will understand this, and Carlos, you would understand this too. In our cultures, what do we usually glorify in terms of pursuits? We usually want our kids to be scientists or doctors or engineers, and there is nothing intrinsically wrong with that. But we need more Christians, we need more young people going into areas like philosophy and literature and theology and the arts and the humanities, so that we can bring this influence to bear on the intellectual life of the academy. It is always the arts, it is the humanities that is the heart of the academy, not the sciences. That's how it's always been, because all the value systems, all the philosophies, all the ideologies are manufactured, they're engineered in the humanities to a large extent. And then they're applied in the sciences. And so unless we get into these realms from within the church, into these arenas, into these areas, and have that influence, unless we get into dialogues, it'll become very difficult for us to bring some of the concerns of the church into the academy. It'll be very difficult for us to bring correctives to the academy. It'll be very difficult for us to bring the truth of the content of the Word of God into the academy. There are many people doing that now. I mean, we can name a number of them, right? I mean, Alistair McGrath was one of them, William Lane Craig, J.P. Morgan, all these people are involved in it, but we need more people to be involved in it. And that really means that we need to re-navigate how we view the academy, how we view calling, how we view, God's call upon a person's life. Because sometimes I think parents, because of fear, because of the financial benefits of certain fields other than other fields, force their children into particular fields. I mean, we talk about abortion all the time. We talk about aborting children and so on. I want to ask this question: how many times have we aborted a theologian? How many times have we aborted a literary figure? How many times have we aborted a poet? How many times have we aborted someone who could have been involved in philosophy and really influenced and impacted the academic culture? And so we need to be very careful. We need to pray as we pray for our children, for the next generation, even as God's calling upon our lives becomes clear. We need to ask these questions. Are we doing things for the sake of pragmatics, or are we doing things to be productive within the kingdom of God, within the economy of God? And so these are some of the things in terms of the academy and the church that we need to really converse and be vigilant about.
Finney, I could not agree with you more. And obviously, this is one of the things that we at Reasonable Truth care about. We care about bridging academia and the church. And for those of you listening online, Finney himself is doing one of those incredible works of bridging academia and the church, and he's taking a lot of spiritual principles and in all of these talks and lectures that he gives at all these prestigious universities and places like that, and he still brings the academic world to churches that he speaks at as well. So definitely, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to post your website and any other resources that you recommend, Finney, for people to get some biographical information about you. If you're interested in what Finney is doing and some of his work and things like that, I'll make sure to post those notes in the description section of the episode today. Guys, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation today. It's been very stimulating intellectually, emotionally. I'm positive that our listeners have really benefited from it today. Carlos, my friend, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you making the time to be able to join us.
Oh man, it was great. Great. It's always good to be here.
Wonderful. And Finney, my brother, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a very, very busy man. I appreciate you taking the time. And hopefully now that we're done talking to you, you can put a few lozenges in your mouth or something and relax that throat of yours. I know you've been speaking for several days now, several weeks. But I really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you for having me. It was a wonderful time for me with you and with Carlos. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah.
Wonderful, guys. All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode of the Reasonable Truth Podcast. If you did, make sure to follow us on Apple iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and share it with your friends and family. For more information on the ministry, visit reasonabletruth.org. That's reasonabletruth.org. And until next time, keep the faith and see you on our next episode of the Reasonable Truth